I was refilling my water bottle at the office kitchen sink when my phone buzzed with a text that would end up costing my aunt everything she'd spent 15 years building. My Aunt Denise wrote, "You owe me $30,000 for the years I raised you. Time to pay up." I read it twice, standing there with the tap still running, water overflowing my bottle and pooling on the counter, because for a second I genuinely thought it was a scam text meant for someone else. "My name is Priya. I'm 29 years old, and until that Tuesday afternoon, I thought I understood my own childhood." Let me back up, because the number $30,000 doesn't mean anything without the years behind it. When I was 11, my mother was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition that put her in and out of hospitals for the better part of 4 years. My father had already been out of the picture since I was 4, a man I knew mostly from a handful of photographs and a last name I still carried. So when my mother's health collapsed, there wasn't a spouse to step in. There was my Aunt Denise, my mother's older sister, who lived 2 towns over and had, according to every version of the story I'd been told my whole life, dropped everything to take me in. I grew up believing that story the way you believe the sky is blue. Denise sacrificed her career, I was told. Denise gave up dating, gave up a promotion, gave up her own peace of mind, all so that her sister's daughter wouldn't end up in the foster system while my mother fought for her life in a hospital bed 3 counties away. Every holiday, every birthday, that story got retold, usually by Denise herself, usually with a specific weight to it, like a bill quietly accruing interest that she never fully cashed in until that Tuesday. I sat down at my desk, put my phone face down, and tried to keep working, but I could feel my hands shaking. 10 minutes later, my Uncle Marcus texted, "She gave up her life for you. The least you can do is pay her back." Marcus is Denise's husband, a quiet man who mostly stayed out of family disputes, which made this one text land harder than if my aunt had sent 10 more herself. If Marcus was weighing in, this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment demand. This had been discussed, planned, maybe rehearsed. Then my cousin Talia added her voice to the thread. Talia is Denise and Marcus's daughter, 2 years younger than me, someone I'd grown up with more like a sister than a cousin, sharing a bedroom for years in that house. "Don't be ungrateful," she wrote. "She's the only reason you survived." That last line was the one that actually made my chest tighten, because it wasn't just about money anymore. It was rewriting the entire narrative of my childhood into a story where I owed my very existence to my aunt's generosity, and where questioning the number $30,000 made me a bad person. I want to be honest about something here, because context matters more than anger. I did love my aunt. I do, in whatever complicated way you can love someone after a day like the one I'm describing. She fed me. She drove me to school when I couldn't concentrate because my mother was in the ICU. She sat with me at a kitchen table doing algebra homework while pretending not to notice I'd been crying. Those things happened. I'm not writing this story to erase them. I remember one night in particular, maybe 6 months after I moved in, when I woke up around 2 in the morning convinced my mother had died and nobody had told me. I walked down the hallway of Denise's house in bare feet, shaking, and found her still awake at the kitchen table, sorting through bills under a single lamp. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just pulled out the chair next to her and let me sit there until I calmed down, then made me a cup of the terrible instant hot chocolate she always kept in the cabinet, and we didn't talk about my mother at all. We talked about a television show I liked. I've held on to that memory for 18 years as proof of something steady in a chaotic stretch of my life. And even now, knowing what I know, I don't think that particular night was fake. I think it was real and complicated and true at the same time as everything else I would eventually learn. That's part of what made the $30,000 text so disorienting. It wasn't that I doubted every kindness. It was that the kindness had apparently come with an invoice attached the whole time, one she'd simply chosen not to show me until it suited her. But $30,000 is a specific number, and specific numbers come from somewhere. That's the part that started gnawing at me before I'd even left the office that day. I didn't respond to any of the 3 texts right away. I finished my shift on autopilot, barely remembering the drive home, and that evening I sat on my couch with my laptop open, doing something I probably should have done years earlier. I started digging through old paperwork. My mother passed away 6 years ago, after her condition finally caught up with her lungs. In the aftermath, I'd inherited a storage unit full of her files, most of which I'd never gone through in detail because grief has a way of making paperwork feel unbearable. I knew there was a manila folder labeled Priya Legal somewhere in one of the boxes, and I spent 2 hours that night pulling folders until I found it. Inside was a stack of documents I hadn't looked at closely since I was a teenager, back when I didn't understand what any of it meant. Custody transfer paperwork, guardianship filings, and underneath those, a series of letters from the county's Department of Children and Family Services addressed to Denise, spanning nearly the entire time I lived with her. I want to describe the moment I understood what I was looking at, because it didn't hit me all at once. At first I thought the letters were standard guardianship correspondence, updates about my school enrollment, that kind of thing. But as I read further, I found line after line referencing monthly stipend payments, foster care reimbursement payments, because somewhere in the process of my mother's hospitalization, instead of pursuing informal kinship guardianship, which many families do without government involvement, Denise had gone through the formal foster licensing process, which meant she had been a registered foster parent, receiving a monthly payment from the state for my care, for the entire 4 years I lived in her house. I sat on my living room floor at 11 at night with those letters spread out around me, doing math I never expected to be doing. 4 years. A monthly stipend that, according to the letters, increased twice during that period as I aged into a higher reimbursement bracket. I added it up on my phone's calculator, checked it twice, and the number that came back was just over $31,000. Almost exactly the figure Denise had texted me that afternoon, except in the opposite direction. She hadn't spent $30,000 raising me out of the goodness of her heart. She had been paid roughly that amount by the state to do it. I want to describe what that specific hour felt like, because it wasn't a single clean realization. It came in stages. First, there was disbelief, the assumption that I must be misreading the letters, that reimbursement surely meant something smaller and less significant than what the number in front of me suggested. So I read the letters again, slower this time, and found the same language repeated across different months in different years, always with a dollar figure attached, always addressed to Denise by name as the licensed foster caregiver of record. Then came a kind of numb clarity, the sensation of watching a story you've told yourself for 2 decades quietly rearrange itself into something else entirely, without your permission. And underneath both of those, something closer to embarrassment, which surprised me more than the anger did. I felt embarrassed that I'd never once, in 18 years, thought to ask how the finances of those 4 years had actually worked. I had simply absorbed the story I was given, the way children do, and carried it into adulthood without examining it. I also found something else in that folder that night, a detail I almost missed because it was buried on the second page of one letter rather than the first. The reimbursement program Denise had been enrolled in included a clause about respite care credits, additional payments available to foster caregivers for arranged weekend or short-term breaks from full-time care. There were 3 separate entries referencing these credits being claimed, each one tied to a specific date. I didn't recognize any of those dates as times I remembered being away from her house. I made a note of them, not sure yet what they meant, but certain they mattered. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was furious, although I was, somewhere underneath the shock. Mostly because I was recalculating an entire childhood in real time. Every story I'd been told about sacrifice, Every meaningful look across a dinner table meant to remind me of my debt. Every birthday card that mentioned how much Denise had given up for me. All of it sat differently now, knowing there had been a check arriving every month the entire time. I want to pause here and say something important, because I've thought about this a lot since. Being a foster parent isn't easy, even when it's a relative you love. The stipend doesn't cover the emotional labor, the sleepless nights, the actual parenting. I'm not writing this to suggest Denise did nothing for me, or that money erases the human parts of what she gave. What I am saying is that she built an entire narrative around personal sacrifice, while omitting the fact that the state had been compensating her the whole time, and then she used that incomplete narrative to demand $30,000 from me as an adult, as though the money had come entirely from her own pocket, as though I owed a debt that had in fact already been paid by someone else. The next morning, I didn't respond to the group text. I went to work, sat through a meeting I don't remember a single detail of, and during my lunch break I drove to the county records office instead of eating. The woman at the front desk, a records clerk who introduced herself as Marlene, explained that as the former foster child in question, now an adult, I was legally entitled to request my own case file, but that the process wasn't instant. She handed me a form with sections I'd never filled out before, boxes asking for my former placement dates, my caseworker's name if I remembered it, which I didn't, and a section requiring notarized identification before anything could be released. It took 2 separate visits and a fair amount of paperwork. On the second visit, Marlene recognized me from the week before and mentioned, almost offhand, that these kinds of requests had become more common in recent years. Adult former foster children reconstructing pieces of their own history that nobody had ever explained to them directly. She didn't ask why I wanted mine, and I didn't offer an explanation, but something about her saying that out loud made me feel less alone in what I was doing, like I wasn't the only person who'd discovered a gap between the story they were told and the paperwork underneath it. 11 days later, an envelope arrived at my apartment with the county seal on it. I sat at my kitchen table before opening it, the same kind of table where Denise had once made me hot chocolate at 2 in the morning, and I thought about that irony for a moment before finally breaking the seal. Inside was the full file, not just the letters my mother had kept, but the complete county record, including the exact monthly payment amounts, adjusted for the 2 rate increases, spanning the entire 4 years, along with confirmation of the 3 respite care credit claims I'd noticed in my mother's folder. I cross-referenced those 3 respite dates against an old family calendar I still had saved as photos on an external hard drive, something I digitized years earlier during a period of trying to organize my mother's things. 2 of the 3 dates lined up with weekends I remembered spending at my grandmother's house, which Denise had always framed as giving you a change of scenery, rather than what the paperwork now suggested it actually was, a scheduled break she'd been separately compensated for taking. The total, once every payment and every credit was accounted for, came to $32,400. I sat with that file for another week before I decided what to do with it. I thought about calling Denise directly and confronting her over the phone, but I've learned that confrontations delivered in anger tend to get remembered as the angry moment rather than the truth being delivered. I thought about ignoring the whole thing, blocking the group thread, and letting the silence speak for itself. But something about the word survived that Talia had used kept bothering me. My cousin genuinely believed I owed my survival to her mother's personal financial sacrifice. She deserved to know the truth too, not just Denise. So I didn't write an angry message. I didn't accuse anyone of lying. I photographed the first page of the official county payment record, the one with the letterhead, and the total compensation summary clearly printed, cropped it so it showed exactly what it needed to show and nothing more, and sent it to the same 3-person thread with a single line underneath it. I looked into this. It looks like the $30,000 was already paid by the state as foster care reimbursement. Happy to talk if there's something I'm missing. I want you to notice that I asked a question instead of making an accusation. I genuinely left room for an explanation, because I try to operate that way, even when I'm fairly certain of what I'm looking at. Then I put my phone in a drawer and went to make dinner. By the time I checked it again, there were 14 missed calls. 11 from Denise, 2 from Marcus, 1 from Talia. There was also a voicemail from Denise that I still have saved, in which her voice starts out defensive. You don't understand how expensive it was to raise a child. That stipend didn't cover everything, and gradually shifts into something quieter, almost pleading by the end. Please don't show anyone else this. Please, we can talk about this privately. That request, more than anything else, told me everything about what this had actually been. If the story Denise told our extended family was true, if she really had sacrificed her own resources out of love, there would have been nothing to hide. The county record wouldn't have been a threat. But the fact that her first instinct was damage control, not clarification, confirmed something I'd already started to suspect. The story of personal sacrifice had been curated for an audience, and I had just handed that audience a document that didn't fit the script. I called her back the next day, not to fight, but because I did want an actual conversation, one where I could ask the questions that had been sitting in my chest for a week. She answered on the second ring, and her voice had lost all the certainty from the original text message. I asked her directly whether she had received the foster care stipend the entire 4 years. There was a long pause before she said yes. I asked whether she'd ever planned on telling me that. Another pause, and then she said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. I didn't think it mattered. I still gave up my life for you regardless of the money. I asked her about the respite credits next, the 3 dates that lined up with weekends at my grandmother's house. She got quiet in a different way this time, less defensive, more careful. She said the credits existed because the licensing program required documented breaks for caregiver well-being, and that claiming them was standard practice, not something specific to me. I believed that part, actually. What I didn't understand, and told her so, was why she'd never once mentioned to me, in 18 years, that those weekends at my grandmother's had a formal name and a formal payment attached, while simultaneously telling me at every holiday how much she'd personally sacrificed without any support. You make it sound calculated, she said. It wasn't like that. I wasn't sitting there thinking about reimbursement codes while you were crying at 2 in the morning. I told her I believed that too, and I meant it. I don't think Denise spent those 4 years running a spreadsheet in her head, weighing compensation against affection. But somewhere between then and the text message demanding $30,000, a version of the story had solidified in her memory that left out an entire category of fact, and that version was the one she'd chosen to act on as an adult, making a financial demand of another adult. I told her I understood that being a foster parent, even to a relative, wasn't easy, and that I wasn't trying to erase the real things she'd done. But I also told her that there's a difference between being compensated for a genuinely difficult job and being owed an additional $30,000 on top of that compensation, and that difference is exactly what she'd tried to collect from me without mentioning the first part existed at all. She didn't have a response to that. The call ended a few minutes later, quieter than it started, with no resolution, no apology, just a kind of mutual exhaustion. The fallout in the extended family happened faster than I expected. Talia called me 2 days later, and this conversation went differently than the one with her mother. She started by asking if she could come over, which she'd never really needed to ask before, but the request itself told me she understood something had shifted between us that a phone call alone might not fix. When she arrived, she was carrying a small box of her own, papers she'd pulled from a filing cabinet in her parents' garage after our exchange, wanting to check the story herself rather than just take either of our word for it. We sat on my kitchen floor, the same way I'd sat with my mother's folder weeks earlier and went through the pages together. Talia confirmed what I already knew, and she told me something I hadn't considered, that the stipend had continued for several months after I turned 18 and technically aged out of active daily care, because the paperwork transition took time to process, meaning there was even more money involved than the original county file had fully captured. She went quiet reading that part, and I watched her do the same math I'd done alone in my living room, watched her face shift the way mine must have that first night. "I called you ungrateful," she said eventually, not looking up from the papers. "I said you're the only reason you survived was because of my mom's sacrifice." I told her she didn't need to apologize for that, because she'd been operating on the only information she'd ever been given, the same version I'd been given for 18 years before I happened to have a storage unit full of my mother's old files. It wasn't her fault the story had a missing page. It had been missing for both of us. Talia and I stayed close after that, closer in some ways than before, because for the first time we were dealing with the actual facts of our shared childhood instead of the version that had been curated for us. We started talking more regularly, not about the money, mostly about ordinary things, but there was an ease to it now that came from not having to perform gratitude around each other anymore. My grandmother, Denise, and my late mother's mother eventually heard a version of the story through Talia, and she called me directly, which she rarely does. Her voice on the phone was steadier than I expected, and she started by asking me to tell her the numbers myself. Not because she doubted them, she said, but because she wanted to hear them in my voice rather than secondhand. I read her the total from the county letter, $32,400, and there was a pause on the line long enough that I asked if she was still there. She was. She told me she'd always privately wondered how Denise managed those years financially, raising a household that had suddenly grown by one person during a stretch when Marcus's own job had been unstable, something I hadn't known about at the time. She said she remembered offering to help with money once, early on, and Denise waving her off, saying they were managing fine. My grandmother said that response had never quite made sense to her, given everything else she knew about their finances back then, and that the explanation, once she finally heard it, filled in a gap she'd carried for years without realizing it was there. She didn't defend Denise, and she didn't condemn her either. She just said, quietly, that she wished someone had simply told the truth from the beginning, because the truth, even the complicated version, would have been easier to live with than the story that eventually fell apart. Some silences carry more weight than long conversations, and the one that followed that sentence was one of them. New name. As for Denise, the demand for $30,000 never came up again, not directly, but something shifted in how the extended family talked about those 4 years. The story used to be told at every gathering, a kind of family legend about sacrifice and love. I noticed, over the following months, that it stopped being told at all. Nobody announced that the story had changed. It simply disappeared from the rotation of things people said out loud, replaced by an unspoken understanding that the version we'd all grown up hearing wasn't the complete one. I didn't cut Denise out of my life entirely. We still speak, occasionally, mostly around holidays, mostly briefly. There's a distance now that wasn't there before, not because I'm punishing her, but because trust, once you learn it was built on an incomplete story, doesn't rebuild itself just because the immediate conflict has passed. I send a card at Christmas. I show up if there's a serious family event. But the easy warmth, the assumption that she had my back unconditionally, that's gone, and I don't know if it's coming back. What I keep thinking about, months later, is how close I came to just paying it. If I hadn't happened to have that storage unit, if my mother hadn't kept those old letters, if I'd simply trusted the story the way I'd trusted it my whole life, I would have taken out a loan, emptied part of my savings, and handed over $30,000 to a woman who had already been compensated for the very thing she was asking me to pay for again. I think about how many other families this happens in, quietly, without anyone ever finding the paperwork, without anyone ever asking the question out loud. I've talked to two friends about this since, both of whom grew up in similarly complicated family arrangements, and both of them admitted they'd never once looked into the financial side of their own upbringing either. One of them, a coworker named Devon, told me his grandmother had raised him for a stretch during his parents' divorce and had spent years hinting, gently but consistently, about how much it had cost her. He said hearing my story made him want to ask her directly for the first time, not out of suspicion, just out of a sense that he'd never actually asked the question and probably should. I don't know what he found, if he ever looked, but I think about that conversation often. How one uncomfortable discovery in my own life ended up nudging someone else toward asking questions they'd been avoiding for years. I also think about the version of this story where I never dig, where I simply pay the $30,000, resentful but compliant, and where the family narrative continues exactly as it always had, uninterrupted for another generation. Talia has a daughter now, young but old enough eventually to hear family stories the way we both once did, uncritically as fact. I like to think that whatever gets passed down to her will be a slightly more honest version than the one Talia and I inherited, if only because the two of us know now to ask better questions before we accept the answers we're given. I don't think Denise is a cartoonishly cruel person. I think she's someone who did a genuinely hard thing, who also, somewhere along the way, convinced herself that the hardship alone entitled her to more than she'd already received, and who built a story elaborate enough that even she may have started believing the version without the stipend in it. That doesn't make the demand okay. It just makes it human, in a way that's almost more unsettling than if she'd simply been lying for sport. Pund. I still have that manila folder. I keep it in a drawer in my apartment now, not hidden, not something I think about daily, but present, the way certain kinds of proof need to remain present even after the immediate crisis has passed. Every so often I take it out and reread the numbers, not out of anger anymore, but because it reminds me of something important. The story you're told about your own life isn't always the full story, and sometimes the people who tell it aren't lying exactly. They're just leaving out the one detail that would change everything, and hoping you never go looking for it. So here's what I keep asking myself, and maybe you can answer this one better than I can. If someone spends years telling you a story about what they sacrificed for you, and it turns out they were compensated for most of it the whole time, does that erase the real care they gave you? Or does it just mean the debt they think you owe them was already paid by someone else a long time ago? I'd genuinely like to know what you think, because I still haven't fully decided for myself.